attraction of investments to the city-state. So you have to understand not just perhaps what they say, but their geography, where are they situated, why is the Philippines feeling outside, why are we less informed? And I said, perhaps because we are a maritime ASEAN. It's part of our insularity, perhaps. I don't know. I don't want to blame anything, but there is this sense that there is continental ASEAN, and soon they will be linked by a railway made by China, by the way, and then we have a maritime ASEAN. And perhaps just to comment very quickly on everybody, I would like to thank you, Father, for being here. I think the first real big multinational is the church, so we have to learn a lot from you.
It's the biggest business.
And in the Philippines, the first multinational, I think, in Southeast Asia is SGV in terms of professional services. And that's promoting my office. I'm now advisor to Mr. Sisip, so I have to tell you about SGV. We were among the first to open a branch office in Vietnam before the Vietnam War, in Indonesia, in Thailand. And today you can still see the SGV people over there. So perhaps we had the ASEAN spirit in us, even before ASEAN was really getting on to its economic cooperation program. Now, I'm delighted to hear about complementation from the health services, and I do believe this is the word to talk about today. Competition is fine, but complementation to me is key in the discussion of economic integration in ASEAN. Where are you best at to fit into the bigger picture of the bigger market? If you remember, during the early days of ASEAN, the Philippines was one of those, together with UNDP assistance, by the way, in 1969, we talked about complementarity. And during my days in ASEAN Secretariat, Nestle did a very fantastic program of complementarity. They will produce Kit Kat in Malaysia and send it to the Philippines on a special relationship on the ASEAN complementary system. We would make the noodles in Bulacan and send that to Indonesia and all of that. So in a way, looking at how the development of ASEAN integration is going, it's moving on again to complementarity. Where are you best at is what will, I think, be the key to our participation in the integration process. Now, by the way, the Indonesians are very keen to learn something from us on health, and we have to learn something from them as well. I was just there recently, and one of the biggest wellness company there want to come into the Philippines, and so we matched them with a Philippine company in Tagaytay. And this is the way to do it. Where are you good at? And that's where we can be an active participant. You talked about industry investments. Yes, you were most positive, and I think that is where we too, at again another advertisement, Ernst & Young came up with a very good paper on investments in ASEAN. And if you want to know very, very detailed information on how investments are going, have been going, and can go, Ernst & Young did a wonderful study on that. Now on mining, you touched a soft spot in my heart, because mining, I felt, was a very strong, the Philippines was in a very strong position after the signing of the mining law in 1995, and after we cleared the constitutionality of that, we went into organizing a private sector, public sector dialogue, which I organized, called the Mineral Development Council, where everybody can come with their issues to the table and that both will listen to each other. However, that died off for some reason or the other. Perhaps, well, I left for Germany, so that left it to Mike Toledo to take care of. But there is that great importance of dialogue between the public and private sector, And if you or we at AAM could provide that table, I think we can move forward. And by the way, the other ASEAN countries copied our Mineral Development Council, and they're operating it better than we have because we have canceled it out. Competition. I think, of course, we've covered that from the very beginning. And again, for me, the key here is dialogue. I hope that the private sector will be more assertive in getting together with government who commit you all the time and you don't know you were committed. If you come, perhaps, if we do have our ASEAN society, to have an institutional approach, to have this dialogue between government and the private sector. In terms of the ASEAN evolution, I hope that by 2017, when ASEAN will be 50 years old, be 50 in government, Philippines will be hosting ASEAN as a chair. So if we start working now, I hope that by 2017, we will be able to give a better picture of ourselves, and perhaps we hopefully don't slide down to the CMLV, not to the CMLP. You know what I mean? It's the second tier, which is the lower tier, which is Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. And we feared for a moment, and Vietnam, we feared for a moment that Vietnam would be replaced by P, which is Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and the Philippines. And I hope it doesn't happen, because we are a founding member of ASEAN. We were among the first to lead ASEAN in terms of a regional integration community, and we have been very active in the past, as far as I know, in developing that Southeast Asian community, small letter C, to the big letter C of ASEAN community. That will be my paper next week in Singapore. And if I may give you I promised the Secretary General of ASEAN, the former Rod Severino, he said, Delia, if you ever speak to another Philippine meeting on ASEAN, please make them listen to how ASEAN is pronounced on our film, because sometimes we cannot correct our countrymen when they're dealing and they call it in different names. And all the others would carefully listen and say, what is he saying? Is it the same organization? And it's called ASEAN. So I hope that is the only word that I can contribute to you today. And that will fulfill my promise to Mr. Severino, who was our Secretary General of ASEAN. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Albert. And we will always remember it as ASEAN, not as anything else. I know you have to rush, so thank you very much for your insights. And may I ask everybody to give a round of applause for Ambassador Albert. Now, may I now turn the floor to my former professor, Professor Acharya, to respond to the questions that have been posed by our industry leaders.
We would just like to recognize Ambassador Delia Albert for her contribution in this panel discussion. So awarding the Certificate of Appreciation is our Head for Marketing and Communications, Ms. Rochelle Valderian. The Certificate of Appreciation says for her exemplary participation as a dialogue leader in this panel discussion. Thank you for your contribution. Charmaine, back to you.
Thank you, Ace, and Professor Acharya.
Yes, it is a pleasure to actually speak after Ambassador Delia Albert. She's leaving, but I can tell you that everything she said about ASEAN and its origin, it resonates with a lot of things I've written in my book, and it's partly because She's the kind of person I interviewed when I wrote my book. You know why ASEAN is successful and CETO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, wasn't? Because ASEAN is ours, as she said. It was very clear, and I spent a lot of time explicating this, that ASEAN is an indigenous organization to Southeast Asia. The Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, of which Philippines was a member also, wasn't. It was an American-sponsored organization. So ownership is very important. Whether it works or doesn't work, at least it survives. And the ASEAN way, I can tell you that I have taken a lot of flack in my academic life for being the first one to actually make sense of the ASEAN way. A lot of my Western friends criticize me, said, well, there's nothing ASEAN way, this is nonsense. I said, you haven't been to the region, you haven't talked, there is something called the ASEAN way. And it's not just consensus consultations, it's the spirit that ASEAN is more important than individual countries, that sometimes you have to compromise, not because it's in your interest, but because it's in the ASEAN way. And I'm very happy that she confirmed and corroborated much of what I've written about ASEAN in my book and other articles, and taken a lot of criticism from people who don't know much about ASEAN outside. Now, in the case of Philippines, and also she confirmed that ASEAN's main motivation was not economic, but political and security, and including the Malaysia-Philippines dispute in Sabah, which was one of the crises that unfolded just when ASEAN was being created. So keeping all that in mind, I like to see if I can address some of the more technical questions that we heard from our 5 industry and 4 industry and 1 from the faith representatives. The way I looked at their comments is, first of all, these are educational for us. To a lot of unanswered questions about ASEAN and ASEAN Economic Community. I don't think these questions have answers easily. Only time will tell how they will be resolved. For example, the question of harmonization. How can we actually have harmonization or standardization when national governments have different regulatory standards? In fact, one of the biggest challenges to ASEAN Economic Community, the ASEAN Economic Community was, in a sense, is a paper that was negotiated by governments, and it sort of looks at a whole range of issues from a standard template. But individual countries differ, and they have different national regulations. It's pretty hard to, for a regional blueprint to standardize national regulations. National regulations are so different, and they are sometimes non-tariff barriers. They become non-tariff barriers. So the ASEAN Economic Community can harmonize tariffs, but it cannot address non-tariff barriers. And this is one of the biggest challenges to the ASEAN Economic Community. And I also learned that the ASEAN Economic Community is, or economic cooperation is not a panacea, meaning that it can solve all the problems. It sort of makes you aware of what are the challenges to cooperation. It provides some prescriptions, but it's not going to solve all the problems of the region, including economic problems. When you have so many differences in taxes, I mean, the European Union is facing the same problem. They have a common currency, but they don't have a common fiscal policy. So as a result, countries like Germany and which are the northern European countries with good fiscal policy, earn more, spend less, or live within their means, they were subsidizing countries like Greece and Spain who were earning less and spending more. And they suddenly woke up a few years ago that it's unsustainable. Currency, your national policies are different, and you don't have a common fiscal policy. Now, if European Union cannot do that, ASEAN is not even close to being the European Union. And so unless ASEAN has policies like this will be the level of your fiscal deficit, or this will be the budget deficit for that matter, this will be a tax rate bracket, Unless you do that, it's always going to be these kind of problems. So regional economic cooperation, and I don't want to also use the term integration, because I knew from day one integration was never accepted in ASEAN. It was always cooperation. Integration was seen as too legalistic. Maybe Philippines was more legalistic because of the American influence, my God's sake. I mean, everybody in the US is legalistic. And Spanish influence too. The European societies like Spain, and they're much more legalistic. Whereas Indonesia, for some reason, had the Javanese culture, speaking for regional cooperation. So Indonesians believe in musyawarah, mufakat, consultations and consensus, and avoiding legalisms, because legalism and binding commitments, the sort of ASEAN way principles. So I think ASEAN is becoming more legalistic, but it's not there. And probably soon be there. I'll give you an example. ASEAN has this dispute settlement mechanism, okay? ASEAN Free Trade Area had it, now the ASEAN Economic Community. You know that supposed to be when two countries have a dispute, trade dispute, they're supposed to convene under the ASEAN Economic Community or ASEAN Free Trade Area until now, a panel which will then hear and adjudicate. You know, this mechanism has never been used. Every time there is a dispute, it's settled by consultations, bilateral. Similarly, ASEAN has a dispute settlement mechanism for political security matters. It's called the ASEAN High Council. And that is even going back to 1976, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which Ambassador Delhi was talking about. That has never been used either. Never, not even once. Now, we have had some conflicts, sometimes tension between, say, after the Sabah dispute, most recently between Thailand and Cambodia over the pre-Bihar temple, but this was never invoked. Partly because the ASEAN countries see invoking a legal instrument is a sign of bad faith. But also ASEAN countries have done wonderfully well. They go to the International Court of Justice. They go to the WTO. So this is not a regional organization that says that just because we have our own regional grouping, the international instruments are irrelevant. So that's the genius of ASEAN. I mean, just imagine if China and Japan can settle their disputes by going to the International Court of Justice. If the Chinese would agree to take the South China Sea to the International Court of Justice, the Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, we would have a much more peaceful region. So ASEAN actually excels when it comes to peaceful resolution of conflicts, either formally or informally. And give it due credit. This is the biggest achievement of ASEAN, not necessarily the economic cooperation. And as Ambassador Delia said, and I completely agree, and she of course cited me as well, ASEAN's economic prosperity is a peace dividend. It was peace that created prosperity, not prosperity created peace. That's what ASEAN's original objective was about. Now, moving on very quickly to some of the points. I am not a big expert in health or finance, but I can say that what I heard today, the ASEAN Economic Community is now going to raise or create expectations for for generating new avenues for interaction and cooperation. So if, for example, the idea of a geological mining network, I mean, that would be an advance in ASEAN cooperation. You need to extend the scope of cooperation beyond trade or security to a whole bunch of areas. And this is what is happening. When ASEAN was created, it only had two issues to deal with: political security conflicts, and yes, a little bit on trade preferences, although that came a bit later. Today, ASEAN deals with everything: environment, human rights, forest fires, and illegal migration, people smuggling, drug trafficking, food security. It's not just the same ASEAN anymore. So the scope of cooperation is expanding, and that's what a real community is about. So there's a huge expansion of ASEAN tasks, or ASEAN scope. And similarly, if you extend it to mining, and if ASEAN Economic Community creates this impetus for new forms of cooperation, new avenues of cooperation, I think that will be a major contribution as well. Moving on to the point about this is probably a weak point of ASEAN. I think I heard correctly that what kind of guidelines we can expect from ASEAN if companies have to compete in a regional market. The problem here is who is going to give the guidelines? Now, the Achilles heel of ASEAN is the ASEAN Secretariat. It doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the authority, and when it thinks it has the authority, it doesn't have the resources. And when it thinks it has some mandate after the ASEAN Charter, there is a monster called the ASEAN Committee of Permanent Representatives, which sits there and tells the Secretary General what to do. And I have seen this quite literally as a close friend of the former Secretary General. ASEAN Secretariat is not in a position to give any guidelines. In the European Union, European Council in Brussels, European Commission, has a budget of $1 billion and has even its own foreign service. ASEAN Secretariat has a budget of $16 million and has 160 staff. Now, who is going to give them and who is going to give who guidelines? So until now, a lot of the guidelines, by the way, have been generated by what we call a epistemic community, group of economists and group of experts having a set of ideas and then taking it to ASEAN ministers and turning into policy. But there is really no ASEAN. ASEAN is not a supranational organization. It doesn't make policy for the government, doesn't give guidelines. So you just have to live with that fact. But I wish ASEAN Secretariat can have more knowledge base, more capacity, and to create these guidelines. On the question of healthcare, same observation. This is an area in which also could become a new frontier for ASEAN cooperation. I hear some very positive, hopeful thoughts here that it will create new networks. It will complement expertise in different ASEAN countries. I think one of the things ASEAN could do, and especially when standards are so different, accreditation rules are so different. Like I have a friend who's a Thai dentist having a tough time getting accredited into Singapore, even now in the last year or so. ASEAN should set up an ASEAN medical college. I think that'll be a great idea. Just like we need also an ASEAN university. Those, like the European Union has a European University Institute. And European Union has a lot of this European Civil Service College, College of Europe rather, which is in Belgium. ASEAN needs to set up these sort of institutions. An ASEAN university, South Asia now has a SARC university, which is actually working very well, better than expected. A medical college where people will compare standards, and that's the kind of institutions that will develop common standards and be in the forefront of rules and standards for accreditation, mutual accreditation. Otherwise, this idea of free movement of labor is not going to work. Free movement of professionals is not going to work. All right, on church. I share the sentiments that the church is one of the foremost institutions for transnational networking. But one thing about ASEAN that we all know, but we don't realize how critical it is. And every time I go to Europe, I shame the Europeans by saying that I said European Union is intolerant, ASEAN is tolerant. The European Union cannot accept a Muslim member, Turkey, but ASEAN already has every faith represented. And that is the single most big selling point of ASEAN. The fact that you have Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, and pockets of Hinduism like in Bali, and of course Confucianism in Vietnam and Singapore, and communism, no religion, no God, technically speaking. This is just a wonderful mix of societies, which the European Union isn't. So this is absolutely important to preserve. So I echo the sentiments of the father who said about the dialogue of civilizations. We're talking about the Islamic State. A few years ago, in 2001, they were talking about Jama Islamiyah setting up an Islamic State. It's a fiction. The Islamic State in Iraq is a terrorist organization. It's not a state. So I keep telling the media in Washington that don't call it an Islamic State. You don't have any idea of Islam. Don't call it a caliphate. The real caliphate was a wonderful institution. the Abbasid Caliphate, who basically translated and preserved Greco-Roman documents, which would have been lost to the generation. And these Arabic translations of the Aristotle and of the Roman writers, which actually informed the Renaissance, because the Italians have lost it. The Arabs actually translated and preserved it, and the Caliphate of Baghdad did it. I mean, it's a wonder. People don't realize that. So the dialogue of civilizations do not clash. They learn from each other. They interact. There's much more evidence of civilizations engaged in mutual learning. India and Southeast Asia, India and China, China and South. These are largely, substantially peaceful interactions. And ASEAN represents that at its best. And this is what ASEAN's main selling point is. So I would fully agree at the idea that ASEAN should promote this dialogue of civilizations. Surin Pitchuan, who was the Secretary General of ASEAN until last year, is a Muslim, and I often invited him to Washington to make the point that ASEAN is an organization of tolerance, diversity, and unity in diversity, living together in peace. And this is something, the European Union always tells us everybody should emulate the European Union. It's a model for the world. I actually said that ASEAN is a model for you and for the world. Thank you.
On the subject of civilizations, this brings us back to what Professor Macarana said this morning about challenges to the Westphalian model. And clearly all the questions that have been raised so far really do pose a challenge as to whether or not we still live in a Westphalian system. And so last but not the least is Mr. Julio Amador, who will give his remarks from the perspective of the government.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to FPLA for inviting me. And I was very glad at first that our industry leader said, our distinguished guest, because I thought he was referring to Ambassador Albert and to Professor Acharya. That means I could keep quiet, because I work in government, but I share some of the misgivings that you have raised, and that might lose me my job. So I thought I was going to keep quiet here. And I wanted to have Ambassador Delia Albert here because I wanted to apologize to her because I mispronounce ASEAN on a daily basis. Because I come from a province where my E's become I's at some point. So ASEAN, as long as I understand what it means, I say it. So let me focus on that aspect of ASEAN, which I think is very important for most of our audience here, coming from the private sector, which is the economic community aspect of ASEAN. So what are the 4 goals of the ASEAN economic community, which is, of course, one of the main pillars of this whole ASEAN community thing? First is you want a single market and production base. Second, you want a highly competitive regional economy. Third, you want to have a regional economy that is equitable, that poverty is reduced. And the fourth is that we want this regional economy to be fully integrated into the larger global economy. Translate that into what the Philippine government wants to do, and that means we want to achieve more economic growth. But that doesn't mean that we have to have jobless growth. That's the second part. We want economic development, and that means reduction in poverty by creating more jobs. And in these 2 areas, it's the private sector which has a very important role, because it's actually private sector that can generate jobs, that provides a lot of investment, that trains a lot of people to fill these roles. So we find ourselves in an environment here, in a policy environment, where perhaps we have not been talking properly to each other. And I think we should congratulate FPLA for bringing government, business, and civil society into one room. Because most of the time, the discussion on ASEAN has primarily been government, civil society, and academia. But we need a lot of input from government, because I don't believe that the business sector is at the mercy of government. On one hand, government is pressured by different sectors to be either protectionist or to promote competition. So which should the government support? Sometimes it depends on who's in power. But that also means that we need we need to talk in other forums aside from the formal policy process so that we can get a lot of ideas. And I got a lot of ideas from this forum. And primarily it means that we need to cooperate in several areas, and I can only name 3 at this point. First is that if you want to generate more jobs, you want to have a business environment that is friendly. That means a regulatory environment as well that does not hinder business from investing. We know that in the Philippines it takes how many steps? I don't know why a barangay permit is necessary for a business permit now. I think if you cut down several steps, we'd get more investment.
For power plants.
Yeah, so I think that's one area where we need better input from business. What kind of business environment, what kind of regulatory environment do we need? And this is where business as a pressure group comes in, to be able to talk to the government, and as Ambassador Albert mentioned earlier, to be able to bring these discussion points at the international arena where negotiations are being made. Because ultimately, the government represents all the sectors in this country. And we hope the same for other ASEAN countries now. But in this country where we're supposed to elect our representatives and we send ambassadors in our name, that's the process. Now the second part is a very important aspect of the economy where private-public partnership is necessary, and that is human resource development. That includes education, that includes training, that includes all of those things related to this area. Precisely because we need to find out in this era of ASEAN integration where we should focus on. Do we need to focus on sector-specific skills? Or do we need to develop centers to train for lifelong learning? No? Or what kind of mix is necessary so that we can respond to the changes that the ASEAN economic community will be bringing in to the Philippines? And lastly, but I think these 3 are not, this cooperation should not be limited to just these 3 areas. Lastly is, of course, infrastructure. Of course, we need better airports. I mean, kayo na lang pumunta sa NAIA, di ba? You know how it means to enter NAIA. We need better airports. We need better seaports. No? We need better piers to accommodate large-scale importation and exportation, and all of these things. We need these things. And we need better roads. Because if you want to connect with other ASEAN countries, you want to have better connectivity. And that includes, of course, IT as well. And we all know that we have one of the slowest internet connections in the world. And we are also we're also going to have a power crisis by next year. But the problem has been that I think the government has been, and this is a learning process for me, I've been finding out that the government has been talking too much with their professional associations, but not with the businesses that employ these professionals. And I think the business sector needs to have a role in the negotiation on what kind of regional arrangements do we need so that our professionals get recognized around the region, but at the same time it fulfills the need of the sector to be able to have health professionals from abroad, for example, to come and practice in the Philippines. So I think we need more of those inputs. As well as to the religious aspect, and I wanted to say to Father to bless me for I've been saying things that might be heretical to the government position. The thing is, we need more of the input from the religious aspect or the civil society aspect, precisely because ASEAN has been built to ensure that interstate conflict is removed or at least lessened. And we need a lot of lessons from dialogue that has been fostered by various religious communities in the region. That's why I think we need to invite the religious community to participate more in the ASEAN socio-cultural community, precisely because we have just launched the ASEAN Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, where a lot of these concerns or where a lot of the expertise on dialogue can come in. So I'll leave with those remarks because my eyes are now starting to be more obvious, but I'll accept any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julio. And thank you to the rest of our panelists for their insights and their remarks. Now I would like to open the floor for questions. And if you have any questions, we have microphones all over the room. And if I may ask you to identify yourself and your affiliation before you ask your question.
I just wanted to clarify Attorney Aquino's statement that size matters. In a small village, if you have one hospital, you know that's inefficient. Because the size of a hospital is going to be very costly for one village only. Therefore, it's always relative to a market size. If the companies that you run are so big in one country, but they're very small with regards to the entire region, then you should not be asked to divest. In fact, you should protest. Your size does not matter. It's your size relative to the market. Therefore, in a village, you don't need one hospital. Break it up and say, I need 10 hospitals. You cannot do that because economies of scale is what ASEAN is after. We want more efficient services for consumers to benefit. And this is at the heart of the anti-trust thinking in this country. The antitrust thinking that our lawyers have been educated is Sherman era. I beg to excuse myself from that. There is now a new field called contestability of markets. And this is exactly what you should fight for. Not because you're big, you are bad. You might be big relative to your village, but when ASEAN integrates, you are small. And therefore, you should not be asked to divest like Ma Bell being asked to have many baby bells. So this is going to make the Philippines very uncompetitive. When you force big firms to divest simply because they are big relative to the Philippines, you will soon find out that the Singaporeans and the Thais will eat you out. Therefore, it is size relative to the market that matters. Therefore, in the Philippines debate on antitrust, please use the contestability of markets theory rather than the traditional Sherman antitrust.
Thank you, Professor. Attorney, would you like to comment on that?
Actually, that's precisely our point. And our point is, that's one. Because you need to, the market is ASEAN, it's not the Philippines. So you must measure in terms of market dominance, the ASEAN market, not the Philippine market. In addition, there's always a confusion about size because of efficiency. So size, you need to distinguish. If we acquire this size because of our efficiency in the past, we cannot be punished. You punish efficiency, then what's there to work for? So, and unfortunately, that's the tendency of the legislation that they're going to pass. And that's also the case in other anti-competition laws in ASEAN. It's always nation-centric, forgetting that there must be an effort to develop the ASEAN market. And ASEAN is smaller than China in terms of market, it's smaller than India. So you try to compete even in ASEAN, you try to compete even in ASEAN, the ASEAN companies are not competitive enough if you restrict them nationally.
I'm Gil Gonzalez. I'm not from AIM. No, I'm a staffer for the ASEAN Business Advisory Council for the Philippines. Every time we talk about AEC, I always hear of two things. One is that governments are really just enablers, and that the integration means not to compete with one another, but more to complement. Now, I was thinking, based on the comment that, okay, but who provides guidance and so on? If, Professor, you say the ASEAN Secretariat is not equipped to provide strategic directions, so it's incumbent upon the big business now to group together and say, because the market is not really ASEAN, you're talking of the US, Europe, Japan. But what would you suggest now to governments in the absence of such a mechanism? If we're told that even the mining does not have an ASEAN platform as of now, wherein many of this complementation should happen. And if you say there's no, because I've heard also some say that maybe you should come up with a super body to to sort of direct things and say, okay, if this is the strength of ASEAN, this is the market we will cover, and this is how we will split labor, materials, investments, and so on. Somebody who provides that type of strategic thinking, what would you advise governments to do now in the absence of such?
Thank you. Professor?
That's a very good question. I would hesitate to give this to the ASEAN Secretariat because even if you empower them, give them more money, the system is not geared for optimal efficiency. The way they recruit people based on, I mean, there's some open recruitment, but a lot of it is secondment from national governments. There's a lot of politics there, and even if you increase the capacity there, it's not going to go very far. What I would suggest is ASEAN should appoint the equivalent of an eminent persons group, kind of a very high level bunch of people who are drawn from different sectors, from some government officials, economics ministers, the former ministers, some also definitely some people from the private sector, and maybe I would dare say a couple of people from the civil society, and let them ponder this issue, hold consultations for a year with different constituents, and come up with some broad guidelines, and then maybe create a more permanent, I don't know, whatever you call it, competitiveness, ASEAN Competitiveness Council or ASEAN Business Council, but not, it will be kind of a hybrid, not just from the purely private sector, not purely from the government, but it's also an independent body. And that's what I think will be the best model, rather than governments doing it or ASEAN Secretariat doing it. See, the problem with ASEAN Secretariat is the member governments of ASEAN are still very scared that if they really give real power to the Secretariat, they will lose sovereignty. The ASEAN Secretariat today is weaker than what it used to be when Rod Severino was Secretary General. I actually spoke to him about this because Ambassador Severino could sign an agreement to lease a building or do something, buy a ton of paper without going through anybody. Today, the ASEAN Secretary General, Surin Pitsuwan, before I know, he couldn't do it. He has to go to the Committee on Permanent Representatives, who sits there. Before, there was, the ASEAN Secretary General was basically, was a report to the ASEAN senior officials, who basically sat in their home territory, in the home capital. Today, the ambassadors are right there. They're micromanaging. And nobody can deny this. I mean, I've monitored this for 5 years. They would say no. They're micromanaging, sitting right in the same building. Sometimes the junior staff of the ASEAN Secretariat will go over the Secretary General and complain directly to the Committee on Permanent Representatives about the ASEAN Secretary General. How could you function in that atmosphere? The idea was to give ASEAN Secretary General real power, more autonomy, more authority. What has happened is exactly the opposite. We have created a monster in that system. So that's not where I will give a lot of authority for the time being. I would rather create, as I said, a kind of eminent persons group followed by a competitiveness council or ASEAN Business Advisory Council, something which is a combination of government and private sector and civil society.
May I answer that?
Sure.
From the point of view of business, maybe it's what we need is for government to talk to business more often, because the business can tell you what is creating more cost for them. So, for example, we are in the process of putting up a distribution network in the Philippines in preparation for ASEAN 2015. My worry is if the Philippine companies are not ready, we will be buying all over ASEAN goods that are better quality and cheaper and sell that to the Philippines. What will happen? The consumers will, of course, be benefited. Our business will thrive, but what will happen to the Philippine manufacturers? They might lose out because they cannot compete. And what? They will lose. There will be more jobs that will be lost. So my suggestion is government must open its doors so that the private sector can talk to them, because the private sector know which costs can be avoided if only there's more cooperation between the government and the private sector. You know, ASEAN countries, where they have efficiency, the governments are efficient and very modern, they will like this lifting of the tariff because they have all the advantage. The tariffs are lifted, and they are ahead because their companies are more well-financed, better ready to compete. What about the Philippine companies? We will lift our barrier. I'm not saying let's not lift the tariff. I am all for that. But government must help the companies be prepared to compete, must remove restrictions, barriers, which are within the position of the government to lift, so that manufacturing companies can compete. That's all that I'm saying, because I'm really worried when Philippine companies are saddled with inefficiencies, which can be addressed by government, then you're not able to compete. We will be flooded by cheaper, better goods from Thailand, Korea, Indonesia. And what do we have? We will again lose the manufacturing capacity. So I'm not asking for a new institution in ASEAN. I'm asking for dialogue between government and the private sector. So if you can hear, because the business sector knows what's needed in order to make them competitive.
Thank you, ma'am. We have 2 interventions from the panel, so we'll start with Julio.
So I think there are 2 things that we need to consider now. First is that if you look at ASEAN, whatever it is, ASEAN, if you look at how it's done, at the regional environment, really, senior officials and government leaders come in, they agree, but the implementation is at the national level. Therefore, the attack, or should we say, the response from business should be not at pressuring them at the regional level, but at pressuring national governments to adopt more competitive policies. And you're right. Perhaps government and business needs to talk, but perhaps from time to time, business needs to flex its muscles and tell government, hey, these are the regulations that we need, and these are what you should bring when you negotiate. Because remember that in a democracy like ours, accountability is one of the most important factors of good governance. No? And that means we need all sectors to provide their inputs before the government negotiates with ASEAN counterparts. And we need that input to ensure that when they agree to something, the business sector, the religious sector, the cultural sector can say, hey, you committed us to this sort of agreements. Now what do we do and how do we implement these agreements? So it should not be a dialogue of the deaf, but a dialogue of people who really want to make the most out of this community. And I'm not in favor of creating more institutions precisely because we have not been able to make current institutions at the regional level really work for everyone. Has ASEAN really lifted a lot of people out of poverty as a region, not as individual member states? And I think those are questions that rightfully should be asked of member state governments. No? And I think it's very important because I sat through one of these eminent persons group. No? I just grew 5 pounds heavier because of all the merienda. But at the end of the day, it's a repetition of previous things that have already been stated. So implementation is the most important aspect of these agreements, and implementation can only be made at the national level. Because at the regional level, you'll have treaties, conventions, agreements, but the implementation, at least in the ASEAN way, is still given to national governments.
Thank you, Julio. Now we have Attorney Almira and then Attorney Toledo.
I think, this is my personal opinion, I think we're always referring to the government to do something. And it has been years and years that we always say, what does the government have to do with this? What is the government doing? And I think it's not because we do not trust our government or we do not believe in our government. I think what is running our country now is the group of people who are truly committed and nationalistic. The business sector, the non-government organizations, the academic sector, the religious sectors, they are the ones really making the Philippines float. And I think for us always to say this is what the government should do, I think we should just focus on very critical things that restrict the other sectors from doing freely what they have to do. Like for example, in healthcare, just to change the law that only Filipino doctors can practice here. And that restrict all other doctors to come over here and share their talents and work with our doctors to uplift the healthcare industry. So we just have to make the government focus on certain things that they can do very fast. And I think if all the sectors which are now helping the Philippines get afloat, so namely the business, the NGOs, the religious sector, and the professional organizations, will just band together and educate our people on how to change and choose our real, honest to goodness, good government leaders, then only then we will really have a government from which we can ask this and that, and will truly propel the success of our country. So that's my point of view, that, not to give too much pressure also to the government, because the government itself has a lot of concerns and problems to reckon with, even right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney. Now, Attorney Toledo.
Before anything else, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Undersecretary Del Rosario. She's right there, table 11, of the Department of Foreign Affairs, and she is very much active in activities such as ASEAN. And if I'm not mistaken, Madam Secretary, you will be heading the APEC preparations for 2015, and she needs all the support she can get. Thank you so much for joining us today. I agree with the statements given earlier by Marlene, by Amador, and of course by Paniera. To put it bluntly, I think there's a disconnect between government and the private sector, especially as far as preparation for ASEAN integration is concerned. For example, in the case of agriculture, I think definitely Philippine agriculture is not prepared, and this is not being properly addressed in ASEAN. And as Marlene said earlier in our conversations, there will be losers. There will be gainers. There will definitely be gainers in integration, but there will be losers. And the losers are those that are not ready to face the competition that will come. They do say that this is not competition. This is collaboration, complementation, this is cooperation. But really, at the end of the day, I think it's really competition. Because you'll be competing against the big boys in banking, for example. Can you imagine if the Malaysian and Singaporean banks are here? There's no way our banks can compete. I understand from statistics. We combine our old banking industry. It's not even as big as some of the banks based in Singapore and Malaysia. Now, in agriculture, going back to agriculture, it's not just an issue of tariffs. It's also an issue of subsidies. Most of the countries in ASEAN have subsidies. These are what you call the non-tariff barriers to trade. I mean, this must be thoroughly studied. And if this is opened up without the safety nets that we are always talking about, we might fall into the trap to what the farmers have suffered when WTO was passed. Because those safety nets that were being discussed time and time again, for some reason or the other, was not being implemented. That is why agriculture, if one looks at statistics from 2008, 7, and even beyond up to now to the present, it grew by just so much when it could actually produce and contribute more. Same with mining. Mining could be the fifth gear if it's just properly regulated and if it's given a chance to flourish. So I agree with the statements, with the question posed by the distinguished gentleman who is with the ASEAN Business Council, that there must be clear and proper coordination between government and the private sector. Otherwise, I think we will be in the losing end, and the Philippines sadly might just lose to the big countries out there. And I'm not just talking about, I talk about banking, agriculture. There's also, of course, labor as well. There's been a lot of agreements already, but this is still yet to be clarified. And another item perhaps that we should also consider in ASEAN, and I think this will be the game changer, is to liberalize air transport among major ASEAN cities. We always talk about freedom of free flow of goods, services, labor, and capital. Now, with respect to the free flow of goods and services and labor, then it is important that we liberalize our air industry and, more importantly, also modernize our airports. That's a big issue, and you mentioned earlier, Mr. Amador, sadly, NAIA is not something that we can be proud of, and up to now we have not even really addressed that particular issue. So there must be close coordination. Let's really put meat into that PPP thing, because otherwise it will just be lip service again. We envisage cooperation among ASEAN nations, but if by cooperating it means the demise of Philippine business, then I don't think we should.
Thank you very much, sir.
Good afternoon. I'm Rina Manuel from Smart Communications. I'm also the president of the Tax Management Association of the Philippines. A comparison of the corporate and individual tax rates within the ASEAN region would show that the Philippines effectively imposes the highest rate of taxes within the region. So that's why TMAP is actually pushing for the lowering of the tax rates and a more simplified and more equitable tax system. So given this, how crucial do you think is tax policy reform in terms of the ASEAN integration?
Let me just say before anyone answers that I totally agree with you. We should lower our taxes. It's so high. Income tax and even corporate tax at the present level right now, when in fact Malaysia recently lowered it, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Actually, the trend right now within the region is for the other countries to actually start lowering their tax
Exactly.
rates.
Does anybody want to address this
I
particular
just wanted
question?
to make a comment on that one. I'm quite familiar with the PMAP, and this is really one cry of the People Management Association of the Philippines. This is actually what the labor sector is saying, making them poor. Because if they render overtime and they exceed the minimum wage, they are taxed, and with the tax, they even earn less.
Yeah.
And when they work during holidays, all the more, they lose a lot more because the bracket gets higher. And when they're given incentives, bonuses, the same thing happens. And sometimes, if the government, if the business sector gives salary increases, some of them reject the increase because the salary increases will put them to a higher bracket wherein they will be taxed more. So I think the government should really hear this cry of our labor sector so that they will have more income to spend and therefore will really propel the economy. So the lady is right with what she said, that this is the cry of the human resource management practitioners being the representatives and voice of the labor sector.
Thank you, ma'am.
From the point of view of business, just look at it as a service fee for doing business in the Philippines. So if the service fee in the Philippines is 30% or 32%, and in Malaysia it's 15% or 20%, you already know you're not competitive. So it's as clear as that. So that's just the financing cost, and you don't even have to go into the cost of delays in permits, so many more permits. So before we coordinate with ASEAN, businesses and government in the Philippines must coordinate first. So that's I think that will help us, because the business, they're not being very difficult. They will be able to show you. So this is the service fee. With respect to non-financial burden, the permitting, they will be able to show you the peso cost of all of this delay, of all of this permitting. And they will show you the numbers. And so I think before we go out and integrate with ASEAN, we must discuss, because we are a team. We are a team. We are the friends here. Before we go out to the world of ASEAN, we must have a team first. And there's really, I think if you go down to it, it's really a common effort. So why do you need a 35% or a 32% service fee and have just 5 customers when you can lower your fee and have 100 more customers, taxpayers? Isn't that what it's all about? It's not here in the case, not the numbers, it's the total amount that you collect. It's not the number of taxpayers you're after, it's really the growth of the bottom line for the government.
Well, if I may just add to what Attorney Marlin said, and maybe the good news is Senator Sani Angara, a good friend, came from the same law firm, but I was way ahead, is trying to pass a law that will lower income tax and corporate taxes. So perhaps we should write to our senators and to our congressmen to somehow support that law. Because as they say, there are only 2 things certain in this world. It's death and taxes. And actually, too much taxes causes death. So we must really seriously look into this particular issue and how we can also compete with us within ASEAN by really rationalizing our tax measures, because the Constitution is even quite clear. Taxation should be equitable and progressive. But to be honest, right now, I don't think it is. And it must be, and sorry, my classmate Kim Hinares, if you're there, but you're not naman a congressman, so you cannot change the law. You are just an implementer of the law, so I don't blame you. But at least don't look at my income tax. Mahirap na, baka malista ka pa dun sa mga... But having said that, I think that's a very good point raised by the lady from SMART, and I think, honestly, we should really strongly fight for that as well.
And I think just a quick note on that to support your statements, Mike and Marilyn. If you look at the Philippine corporates now, the investment holding companies, the top 6, they're holding about $10 billion worth of cash, $10 billion worth of cash. What does that tell you? In a way, that tells you they're sort of hesitant to put capital to work, and there are not as many investment opportunities that they see in the Philippines. It's actually at an all-time high, their cash holdings at the moment. So I think part of it is also the cost of doing business in the Philippines is too high. The taxation is probably too high, and so Philippine corporates are forced to look, outside for, investment opportunities that will provide them a better return on their investment. Good point.
Thank you. We have a final comment from...
And coming from the public sector employees, I share in that cry, because our taxes are withheld and my payslip cries every time I receive it because of the very high tax. And precisely this is, I think, one of the barriers to investment. I mean, let's face it, almost all of the tariffs are already minimal or close to zero. It's the non-tariff barriers that actually hinder investment, and that includes the taxation system that we have. And it's complicated, it's very high, and this is, I think, where Attorney Pilar's comment earlier about the various sectors that actually make things work should come in. Precisely because we need to, as Attorney Toledo said, we need to pressure our policymakers to reform the tax system so that we can have an equitable tax system that benefits all of us. Because, your government employs around 1.2 million people from Apari to Hulo, and you might hear in the news that there may be some officials accused of corruption, but the rest of us are honest workers, and we get taxed every month, same as you. It's withheld. And we suffer the same thing as many workers in the private sector. So I think this is one area where we could actually join together and say to the policymakers, our taxation system is not making us competitive in the region. Our taxation is in fact very regressive. What do? We need to change that. And I think this is where that multi-sectoral coalition can come in to make us more competitive in the ASEAN arena. Thank you.
Thank you, Julio, and thank you very much to all our panelists. I will now turn the floor over to Ace.
Thank you all. Let's give our dialogue leaders another round of applause. This ends our second session, but before we culminate today's event, I would like to request our panelists to stand and remain on stage. We would also like Professor Macaranas to join us on stage and take the seat of Ambassador Albert. And now, may I request the Management Committee of the First Pacific Leadership Academy to award a Certificate of Appreciation to our dialogue leaders. All very much for this very enriching discussion. May I request the Executive Director and General Manager of the First Pacific Leadership Academy to join in a quick photo opportunity. Request the presence of President De Cree to join in the photo. To be joined by our Executive Director, Mr. Roy Agustin Evalle.